so good to see you both. We're here to talk about your new book, Deliberative Democracy for Diabolical Times. And I'll start with introductions of you both, and then we'll hear a little bit about the book before I can sort of engage us in a few discussion questions. So first we have André Bächtiger. He's professor and chair of political theory and empirical democracy research in the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Stuttgart. And John Dryzek is distinguished professor in the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. I am Molly Scudder. I'm an associate professor of political theory, specializing in deliberative democracy and a lot of the themes discussed in this book at Purdue University in Indiana. And so for this conversation, we're spanning, I think, 16 hours and 3 continents. And we're very excited, as I said, to be discussing this new book, 2024, from Cambridge University Press. Deliberative Democracy for Diabolical Times, Confronting Populism, Extremism, Denial, and Authoritarianism. So we'll get started. If André, you want to start off with some discussion of the book and background and where it came from.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Molly, for having us. And let us start with the inspiration for writing this book. Both of us devoted a large chunk of our academic lives to deliberative democracy. And then there is a little irony. In the past decade, deliberative democracy has become an academic enterprise where deliberative ideals and ideas got institutionalized, mainly in form of deliberative mini-publics. And I think this was almost a bit an unexpected success. But at the same time, we face democratic backsliding worldwide, as well as a deterioration of the quality of public discourse. Brazil, for instance, exemplifies this irony. On the one hand, it has been and still is a hotbed of democratic innovation, such as participatory budgeting and health councils and other forms of citizen involvement. But all this didn't stop the rise of Jair Bolsonaro. And the book tries to shed light on this irony and asks, why is this so and what are potential fixes? Now, the problem, that's what John and I think, is not that citizens have abandoned democratic and deliberative principles. And research continuously shows that people around the globe strongly stick to democratic principles. The problem is more that some elite actors use what we call diabolical strategies to get their way. And these diabolical strategies frequently involve diabolical communicative strategies, for instance, by spreading false information or by dividing publics, by being disrespectful to specific minority groups. Now, we wanted to use that term diabolical, and John came up with it. And maybe, John, you say a bit more what we mean by diabolical.
Right. Well, diabolical literally means bad, but it also means characteristic of the devil. Now, the devil is clever. So challenges are diabolical when they have, in our terms, when they have multiple dimensions, when they're potentially disastrous or catastrophic for democracy or for society in general, when they're subtle and interconnected with each other. So things like populism and extremism have all kinds of interconnections. But importantly, this is where the cleverness comes in. Clever operators have figured out how to prosper in this in this kind of environment. Who are those operators? Who are those clever operators? Well, they might include unscrupulous media figures. I'm thinking of the Murdoch media empire, which happily weaponizes rage, political rage, in large numbers of people for the purposes of the profit of the company. They would include populist demagogues, and of course, Trump would be the exemplar here. I'm not sure Trump necessarily deserves the description of clever, but for whatever reason, he seems to have. So he and his people have stumbled on strategies which clearly work. It includes political extremists who can take advantage of new media technologies to increase their support base and to press and spread their messages all over social media. It includes deniers who can distort norms of even-handedness and fairness to make things like climate change denial, pandemic denial, seem legitimate positions. It includes authoritarian governments who have learned how to simulate democracy through, in some ways, including participatory and deliberative devices, which simulate democracy, but at the same time secure their own power. They can sponsor troll armies, for example, to harass their opponents. We see governments in online. We see governments in India and China doing this, for example. It includes politicians and parties in democracies who are increasingly learning authoritarian strategies and ways to secure their power, even in the presence of seemingly of competitive elections. So those are just some of the many interlinked challenges that we're facing. And of course, the book itself is largely devoted to figuring out how we can best respond to these challenges as deliberative Democrats.
Awesome. Thank you both. I mentioned to you both earlier that I taught this book in my grad seminar this semester on the ethics of political communication, and it was a really the students were really engaged. We had a really wonderful discussion relating to the book, and so yeah, when we discussed getting together to talk about it, I was really excited to have this conversation with you both. So one of the kind of takeaways, the book is a kind of optimistic book in some ways, right? That it's times maybe diabolical. We might be facing democratic backsliding or a retreat of democracy in places that had previously been considered very stable democracies. And the book, my reading of it, part of it is saying you don't have to give up on deliberative democracy to save it. That you can actually sort of support some of the commitments to deliberative democracy, even when you might not think conversation is going to get us very far. And so one question I had is sort of a big picture question, but what do you think? The book is defending a deliberative approach in diabolical times, maybe from people who would think that this is not the time for deliberation. But do you think that the book would speak to skeptics of deliberative democracy, sort of broader skeptics, or why a deliberative approach to democracy in these times and not something more expansive or a democratic sort of unqualified approach to politics? So why the deliberative piece, I guess, is my question.
Maybe I start with the question before, because I think we are not naive, because in a way you can say, of course, people might be incompetent and might be biased if you look at them as individuals. But we start from a sort of new wave in political psychology, but also in political science, saying we should really look at contexts, making us smart or dumb. So individually, we might not be the smartest, but collectively, we might be different. So one of the big messages is look at good contexts like well-structured public spheres, better political systems, kinds of interpersonal networks where you get, for instance, diverse information, and all this makes a huge difference. So there's also experimental research, for instance, showing if you are in a fully polarized environment, the only thing you do is you're listening to cues, to partisan cues, and follow your leaders. But as soon as it is less polarized, you start also listening to arguments. And there's a whole new psychology showing, well, opinion formation, there is a large chunk of argument driving this. Of course not. Argument is not everything, but it's part of our opinion formation efforts. But maybe, John, you want to say something about why we still cling to deliberative democracy and do not go any further?
Yeah, I think for me, I think the core reason for stressing a deliberative approach to all these challenges is that many of them have their roots in the contemporary communicative environment, and in which we in the book refer to as a diabolical soundscape, and just go into all the kinds of communicative pathologies, some of which are well known in terms of the way social media operates, and and so forth. So if the problem is largely a communicative one, then the response, the democratic response, also needs to be communicative. And really, deliberative democracy is, well, it's sometimes referred to as a talk-centric approach, but of course, reflection and listening are central. Well, Molly, of course, you've written a book on listening. So deliberative democracy emphasizes the communicative dimension of democracy. It wants communication to be inclusive, meaningful, and consequential. And so I think it's actually ideally placed to confront the kinds of communicative pathologies which are really, in some ways, the essence of these diabolical times.
May I add one little thing? It's also a personal experience, because when I started my journey into deliberative democracy in the early 2000s, there was a colleague saying, well, looking at things like saying argumentative rationality and engaging with other arguments and respect, this is a sort of an esoteric enterprise. And now I think in times of democratic backsliding and deterioration of public discourse, these kind of utopian standards are kind of standards that many people now want to achieve. So they're also part of a more, you could say, basic talking about democracy. What is the essence of democracy? It's like we'll seem to lose something which was maybe a bit more normal 20 years ago, but now is something that we might want to still cling to. So in a way, deliberative ideals are maybe, let's say, much more realistic ideals these days.
Mm-hmm. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the soundscape concept and how that fits with the argument. I thought that was an interesting sort of diagnosis of a part of the problem that democracy faces.
Okay, I can say a bit if you like. Of course, we've got a whole chapter in the book on it. We're actually careful not to just simply adopt popular notions about echo chambers, the importance of fake news, the idea of filter bubbles where people only listen to like-minded others. I mean, those are sort of very popular ideas and commentary on the contemporary soundscape or media environment. But we need to look at those things closely. So some of the things that we stress in the chapter on the diabolical soundscape are the simple overload of expression. It's never been easier for people to express and communicate their views on political topics. But what's in short supply is reflection. Not necessarily the low quality of expression. So we can think of sort of the pairing of expression and reflection. It's really just the sort of declining opportunities for reflection in the light of this sort of overwhelming quantity of information and often misinformation that people are subject to. And that means that also this goes along with a sort of a lack of argumentative complexity, that simplistic slogans, well, which have always been around, I suppose, but perhaps the complexity of the problems facing the world have increased, but you still get them, and this is perhaps the essence of populism, that you get just a very simplistic set of slogans that can be used in response to complex problems. Brexit means Brexit, build a wall, whatever. And then there is the problem of misinformation and lies. We see this on climate change in particular. And going along with that, a simple disregard for any kind of standards of truth and logic. And it seems that sides which have a complete disregard for the truth can win. They can win elections, as the election and then the re-election of the recent re-election of Trump shows. So these are just some of the aspects of the contemporary soundscape, but we do need to be careful in not simply assuming that the conventional wisdom is right. We need to look very closely at exactly what the problems are.
André, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, in a way, John has perfectly summarized what we understand by diabolical soundscape. But we then also move on a bit and say, well, we also need to look at different contexts in the world. The United States is not Germany, and diabolical soundscapes may exist everywhere, but they still come in very different forms. And that's, in a way, our starting point, because we are also criticizing a bit, let's say, people like Jürgen Habermas, who sometimes also falls into the trap saying, well, there is one diabolical soundscape and this is like all over the place. It's all the same. It's not.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't look at just one democratic context. You take if you want to speak a little bit more about how you approach sort of the cases and the contexts in the book.
Well, it's not a sort of a classic comparative book, but at the end, we really try to, in a way, contrast a bit, at least in the Western world, countries we knew quite well, the United States versus Germany and Switzerland. And you can say, for instance, let's start with Germany and Switzerland. I mean, these are public sphere systems with public media where you get a lot of diverse information. First of all. Second of all, these are also political systems with much more consensual orientations, coalition governments. And all this matters of how political communication is structured, basically. And the very interesting thing here is also in our analysis, these two things are correlated. So consensus system, there is a correlation with public media systems. And the most intriguing aspect, in my view, when you go a bit into the literature, this also transpires into the social media sphere. So again, there, people get more diverse information. And then if you compare that, contrast that with the United States, you really have a two-party system where the one party demonizes the others. You have a public sphere system, which is really biased. And you also have, and that's interesting if you look a bit at this literature, you have interpersonal networks which are much more homogeneous than in other countries. So altogether, American citizens are really kind of exposed to, you could say, information that might lead them to get very distorted views of the world. And it's not to blame them, it's more a structural problem. And others are just in better systems and therefore also can make smarter decisions.
And I think it's important to defend those systems. I
Yes.
know we have a somewhat mixed system here in Australia, but the Murdoch companies are very strong in monopolizing the private part of it, but there's also an important public part, and Murdoch and his allies are continuously trying to undermine the public system and trying to convince governments to defund it.
Yeah, I think the rich examples and the sort of the amount of studies that you bring to show the sort of potential and the power of deliberative democracy for diabolical times is really a strength of the book and what I enjoyed, one of the things I enjoyed most about it. Okay, so another question I had in reading this and also in my discussions in my course, as I mentioned, going back to Habermas, deliberative democracy, right? Some of the power of that communication comes from its sincerity, the sort of non-instrumental use of communication and sort of openness to persuasion, engaging to reach understanding, not consensus necessarily, but sort of engaging for the sake of communicating and not necessarily getting your way or sort of being purely instrumental and strategic. So I'm wondering in reading the book, right, to what level is engaging with the chapters, for example, are how to deliberate with and against populists, how to deliberate with and against extremists, how to deliberate with and against deniers, as well as authoritarians. So how would you respond to someone who worries that this book is articulating a kind of insincere or strategic form of engagement with people who are deemed sort of dangerous for democracy? And so another way to think about this question is, what is the line between persuasion, which is something that deliberation is supposed to pursue, and something like conversion, right? When you're trying to convert somebody, you are not actually open to persuasion yourself, right? You are firm, you are committed to what you want. You're trying to like convert people, bring people over to your side. So yeah, my question is at what level does this kind of approach, identifying people who may be outside the domain of democratic politics, trying to bring them back in, is that deliberation? Is that something else? Yeah, there's those. It's a kind of broad question, but those are my thoughts.
I
Yeah,
would say, John, you need to start because you have been the pioneer, in my view, of bringing in this kind of saying there's a bit more to deliberation than just rational argument. Maybe you want to start?
I think that's right. So Molly, you referred to Habermas and the kind of standards of ideal communication that he begins with, and I've long taken the position that deliberative democracy needs to be more expansive in terms of the sorts of communication it can encompass. The communication still needs to be held to critical standards, but it can include things like the use of rhetoric, for example, in ways that rhetoric sometimes gets sort of criticized, either being mere rhetoric or manipulative. But rhetoric, I think, as well, Simone Chambers has pointed out, can also draw people into more deliberative relationships. It's a way of it's a way of making people think. So when we're dealing, I mean, a lot of the book sort of draws a distinction between problematic leaders who may be beyond the reach of deliberation, and that's where the against part comes in. But then the people who are attracted to them, it may be possible to sort of draw them into more deliberative relationships. And that's where the deliberating with the problematic category comes in, be it populists, extremists, deniers, or authoritarians. And so we can think sort of about multiple forms of communication, including rhetoric, and including sort of trying to figure out how do individuals who are attracted, say, to authoritarianism actually see the world, and then how do we reach those people? So simply trying to reach them through sort of rational argument, perhaps trying to, in the case of climate change deniers, just simply continue reiterating what climate science says and why we need to do something about it. I mean, that seems that we know that gets nowhere. But what it's also possible to do is to try and think about, well, what exactly, how exactly do these people view the world, and what kind of language can possibly reach them? And I don't see that as being manipulative. It's just being expansive. And so we have so one of the examples used in the chapter on denial, it actually relates to a study done by Alex Lowe, and I in Australia, and I co-authored a paper with him on this. And it really deals with the way that climate change deniers see the world, and a lot of what motivates them is it's not simply a matter of them looking at what's happening with the climate and coming to different conclusions. A large matter, it's a question of distrust of government. And so they think that this is not as true of all deniers, but some of them, it's they just think that governments may use the climate change issue just to increase taxes, increase regulations, and do things for their own benefit and for the benefit of special interests. And so, it was interesting that one of the things that could draw climate change deniers into conversation was the idea of an earmarked carbon tax. Not one that would disappear into general revenues, but one that would actually be earmarked for the sort of particular, they could be climate-related projects, but it wouldn't be just for the sake of expanding the scope of government and for government to simply increase its degree of control of society. It would be earmarked. And the parallel in Australia is a very popular tax for the healthcare system that's called Medicare. And so the rhetorical move which could draw climate change deniers into this productive conversation was the idea of Medicare for the climate. And once you framed it in those terms, they thought, Yeah, Medicare, that's a good tax. A good program, a good tax. And so why can't we do that for the climate as well as for people's health? So it's rhetorical, but it also draws people into productive discussions.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. André, did you want to add to that too?
Yeah, I think we could also take a bit more, even a more abstract view. I mean, and that's also something that at least I learned when John and I bumped into Jürgen Habermas in 2018, because what was not entirely clear for me that Habermas has a very systemic understanding of communication, in the sense you can start with lies and kind of rough talk. The question is that rationality is an emergent phenomenon. It comes over time. So you can also say maybe first it's like you try, let's say, even to manipulate someone, but then you also see maybe reasons behind it. So it's not something that happens in one interactions, like in one mini public, and then you learn everything about the world and you go away and everything is fine. No, it's a kind of a process. And for him, it was always the force of the better argument is something in the long run. It's not in the short run. And we also know how difficult it is to crack our own deep convictions. If we really have learned something deep, you don't just give it away. You always find good arguments against it. But over time, things do change. And this is where we have to look at. Of course, this is a methodological challenge, but I think it's a democratic hope at the same time.
Right.
This brings me, I think, maybe one of our last questions, and I'll let you each sort of say final words. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a really optimistic book. I think it gives us a lot of hope for deliberative democratic futures. One of the main takeaways is that no one is beyond, or very few people, maybe some of those really cynical elites, are beyond the realm of communicative engagement, and sort of shows us the value in reinvesting in communication and trying to renew the soundscape. One sort of big picture question I had, as someone who's extremely sympathetic to the project and deliberative democracy, is whether deliberative democracy is up for this challenge. And one of the things I'm thinking of is, at least in my understanding of the evolution of this paradigm, of this sort of approach to democracy, the idea was deliberation in this expansive way that you both described, is a way to achieve legitimate decisions in a context of large diverse societies where there isn't a sort of agreement. And the idea is that if we invest in a procedure that people see as legitimate and inclusive, and inclusive in all the ways that John said too, like including various types of communication, that the outcomes would be more democratic and more legitimate as a result. And so the idea was how to sort of achieve democracy in these contexts of difference and disagreement. And now it seems that the challenge in some ways is for deliberation not to sort of help achieve democracy, but to defend democracy, that we've sort of shifted the challenge back. It's no longer a method or procedure of attaining self-governance. It's a procedure that's going to help us sort of convince, try to bring people into seeing the value of this. And that's some of the value that you identify in deliberative democracy, to sort of help bring people who may be moving beyond the sort of, or not necessarily seeing the value of democratic self-governance, bringing them back into that. So I'm wondering whether you think that assessment is accurate, right? Has the challenge of deliberation shifted to this sort of more meta first question of democracy existing, as opposed to achieve, like how to experience it or live it?
I like that question a lot. And I think I would agree, because I think what we have moved is from process and understanding and analyzing processes of deliberation and good deliberative standards to something what we call in the book deliberative constraint, where we say that it's a sort of, that you would say we expect something like a modicum of argumentative rationality and engagement with others, or civility. That's the thing we want. So it has really, in some way, it's a sort of it becomes a category, as you're saying, of democracy itself in order to function well. So you can say, if you want, and I think that's also true for many activists, if you want to make your ideas stick with others, or your new ideas, you need a sort of a public sphere having this deliberative constraint. Otherwise, it's very difficult. If that's completely distorted, if there's no civility, no one's listening, no possibility to really get your argument transmitted, I mean, then it's really kind of we're losing democracy in itself. So I would say I totally agree, but maybe John, you have a different opinion. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my initial response to that question, Molly, was to look at the trajectory of deliberative democracy over the history of the last 30 or more years. And it did start as a deepening project. I mean, in some ways, I think it took the triumph of liberal democracy from after the fall of the Berlin Wall as given, and thought, well, isn't there more to democracy than this, than just competitive elections and constitutions and human rights? These things are all good things, but isn't there something deeper we can strive for? But then, of course, the context has changed with the arrival of the generally accepted crisis or crises of democracy, and then that's where we enter in the wake of that, in what we call the Diabolical Times, and then the challenge does become to defend existing democratic accomplishments, not just figure out how to deepen existing democracies, and really that's what the book is about. But then I don't see the deepening and the defensive aspects as mutually exclusive. I think we can pursue both of them at the same time, so that in trying to do all the things that we set out in the book, we're not just sort of trying to defend liberal democracy against attacks upon it. We're also trying to move things in key places in a more deeply deliberative direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I want to give you both a chance to just sort of say final words, or maybe where you think this will take us going forward, where you hope this will lead us to future projects and research, or just any final thoughts.
Yeah, my final thought would be, and I think that was for us also something that we found out on the way. There's maybe not one single optimal intervention to set our systems back on track. You need multiple interventions at the same time. It sounds a bit like a truism, but I think many people working on these things sometimes come up with a new hashtag, or even those promoting deliberative mini publics, which we like. It's not, let's say, the magic bullet to save democracies. You need a kind of what we call a whole discourse. We need to renovate a whole discursive infrastructure, or preserve still functioning discursive infrastructures to make democracies work.
Yeah. And I think that's right. But and also, just one thing I'd stress, and we do have a chapter on this in the book, is that I think it still remains the case that while we've focused on problematic categories of people who are attracted to populism, extremism, authoritarianism, and denial in the book, we should bear in mind that most people are actually not in these. In most people, I mean, it varies, of course, from in different places. But most people are not in these problematic categories. And so we talk about deliberating with everybody as opposed to just these particular categories. And that's, and I think it's very important to remember that of course, when it comes to inclusion, democracy ought to be about everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, once again, this is a great book. You should all go out and read it. Deliberative Democracy for Diabolical Times. Thank you, André and John, for the conversation. And I look forward to the next thing.